You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and powered by Overtime Media. I'm your host, Chad Jensen, and with me, as always, stepping into this octagon, if you will, is my partner in crime, who you know and love as the lead NFL writer for Heavy.com. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, the octagon, of course, I say in jest, but it appeared as if two guys at Broncos camp on Monday, that's where they would have preferred to have been.
Yeah, and you know it's bad, Chad, when Derek Wolfe, of all people, is the peacemaker, as he was today, stepping in, intervening, as with Joe Flacco between Courtland Sutton and Emmanuel Sanders today. They were throwing hands, Chad. Hands, water bottles, elbows, everything out there. It got pretty ugly. You know, we talk about it that these fights are not surprising, they're inevitable, but it reaches a new level when it escalates to physical violence as it did today. And I hate to put it in such a grand term, but you can't have that happen between two players on the same team. And as Fangio said, and as we'll get to, it just can't happen.
Yeah, so much to get to today. We're going to dive into it here shortly, but just a couple of quick matters of business. If you're new to the show, make sure you're following us on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. That's how you keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the Huddle Up Podcast in real time. If you're a new listener, you found us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like, comment, and as always, wherever you're listening to this show, if you like what you hear, share it out there. Put it out on social media. Help us reach new listeners, and especially on iTunes as well. Leave a creative review and a 5-star rating if you like what you hear. Fantasy football fans, listen up. Do you want to join the biggest NFL season-long tournament ever? Of course you do. If you love fantasy football, we know you do, then you need to enter the $3.5 million Best Ball Championship on Draft. That's right, $3.5 million in real money. It's freaking huge. Now, it's season long. Here's how Draft works. It's season long, but with no micromanagement. You just set it and forget it. So what does that mean? No longer are you having to agonize over the matchups and who to start and all that. They take care of that for you. They're automatically going to start your most efficient lineup based on all the projections, based on all the momentum, so you don't have to worry about it. You set it, you forget it. Once you're done drafting, that's it. No trades, no waiver wire. You don't even have to set your lineup. As mentioned, your best players automatically get started, and you'll get the best score each and every week, guaranteed. For a limited time only. You can get a free entry into the Best Ball Championship when you make your first deposit, but you have to use our promo code HUDDLE. That's right, a free shot at $1 million just by using our promo code HUDDLE when you make your first deposit on Draft. Just search Draft in the App Store or go to draft.com and come play free with promo code HUDDLE. We thank Draft for sponsoring the Huddle Up Podcast. All right, Zack, so let's set the stage real quick to what happened on Monday. Basically, it was kind of a funky day for the Denver Broncos, and it started off, and we'll talk more about this later in the show, but it started off with on a good note, oddly enough, in that Emmanuel Sanders was finally unleashed to participate in 11-on-11. So for the first time, the complete first-team offense was out on the field because Juwan James was out there at right tackle, Ron Leary was out there, everyone was out there, including Sanders, and initially it looked really good. It looked like a different product, and we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Everything seemed to be going well, and then the Broncos got bogged down by a couple of false starts, some penalties on the offensive line, one of which, of course, came from Garrett Bowles, and then a fight erupts, not just a argument, but fisticuffs thrown between Emmanuel Sanders and Courtland Sutton that had to be broken up, from what I've been told, a few different times, maybe as many as 3 different times. And obviously in training camp practices and practice in general, fights are common. We talked a lot early on about how, we were surprised early that there hadn't been any fights. It took a while for that first little incident to take place at Broncos camp. But what makes this so in that sense, a fight is not that unusual. What makes this particularly a unique situation, though, Zach, is the fact that it was two teammates from the same side of the ball, from the same depth chart. Yeah. Two wide receivers going at each other. So it wasn't just, a lot of times the way a fight gets started in practice is two guys, one on offense, one on defense, are going against each other on a snap, and maybe one guy doesn't take kindly to how hard the other guy's going, or thinks that he was dirty on a play, or just pushed a little too hard, or hit too hard, or whatever, and the guy snaps and tempers fly, and then it's quickly diffused, and that's that. When it's between two teammates on the same side of the ball from the same depth chart, though, Zach, obviously that speaks to further implications. In other words, this sounds and is, let's not just say sounds, this is more of a product of some resentment and issues that have been building between Emmanuel Sanders and Courtland Sutton over at least the last few months. And we can theorize why. We can theorize what seems to be the bone that these two are picking between each other. But, Zach, I have to think that it has a little something to do. We don't know exactly what triggered it today. We can theorize. I can't help but think, though, it has a little something to do with Emmanuel Sanders watching Courtland Sutton anoint himself as the number one receiver when the Broncos showed up at OTAs in April.
Yeah, Chad, it's a good theory, I think, because Sanders sees the writing on the wall. He knows what everyone's talking about. He sees what Sutton does on the field, and he knows Sutton is the future, and Sanders knows he's probably just a one-year rental for this Broncos team right now, coming off an injury. But when you talk about the players that are fighting, look at the players. This is not Derek Wolfe and Connor McGovern going at it, two guys that you would expect to go at it. This is Emmanuel Sanders, who paints himself and projects himself as a leader, and Courtland Sutton, who is a great student of the game, a great teammate, an up-and-coming star for the Broncos. It's unusual, so that says to me that it wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just a one-time thing. Like you said, there's some personal resentment here. There's a personal thing brewing, and I have to think it's some sort of power struggle between Sanders not wanting to give up that wide receiver one throne, and he'll have Sutton pry it from his cold, dead hands. That's honestly what it feels like to me. Yeah. And if it's not that, I don't think what else it could be, especially what we heard Sanders said on the field after what he said in Sutton's direction, which you can expound on.
Yeah, to paraphrase Sanders, he was observed screaming multiple times over and over, "You haven't done expletive in this league." So, in other words, he's saying whatever affront Sanders interpreted from Courtland Sutton, what he's saying at the bottom is that whatever you're doing, your play hasn't justified that yet. You need to take a step back. You haven't proven anything out on the field. And that's, in one sense, I don't want to say I'm siding with anybody because I'm just analyzing this thing for you guys. But that's why I say, though, however, that I'm a little bit more inclined to understand where Sanders might be coming from, because if you look at what happened with Courtland Sutton last year, I mean, he got off to a great start as the third receiver onto the field behind Sanders and Demaryius Thomas before the trade. Made some plays. A lot of times the defense just didn't see him coming. Then, however, when he was inserted as a starter following the Demaryius Thomas trade from Week 9 on, he failed to kind of find those consistent flash plays like we saw the first half of the season. And then really, if you look at the final quarter of the season, where he went from being a starter to being the de facto number one in the final quarter of the season after Sanders went down with that Achilles, let me remind everybody how bad Courtland Sutton was. Not only did the offense come to a screeching halt with Sanders off the field, but Sutton himself had two of those final four games in which he was the number one. Two of those games, he had two or less receptions. One of them was for two catches. One was a single reception. And so, he's talked about, in fairness to Sutton, he's talked about how much of a reality check that was, a wake-up call in terms of the work it's going to take. He's not there yet to be a number one, but also the lessons that he learned from that in terms of helping him get to that next step so that the next time it comes, he's ready to be a number one. But still, Zach, even all that being said, we questioned it when he said on April 2nd, that I'm the number one receiver and I'm looking forward to being a leader and all these things. And we were like, whoa, on the podcast, in our written articles, we're like, Stop the presses. Did the Broncos somehow pull Sutton aside and say, hey, look, you're the man, the torch has been passed? Because that's how he's talking. What we're finding out, I think, reading between the lines here, Zach, is that's not what happened. The Broncos did not pass the torch officially. Sutton took it upon himself to anoint himself the number one receiver, and all the while Sanders has been sidelined, licking his wounds, healing, getting better from that Achilles, the resentment has been building up. And finally he hits the field today as a full participant in 11-on-11, and the floodgates open.
Yeah, I don't think it's any sort of coincidence. And, I love Sanders as a player. He's a great professional of the game. He's a great pass catcher. But let's look at his leadership, or lack thereof, where it's been the last couple years. He's known to blow off practice. He did that a few years ago. It was one of my first stories covering the Broncos. I remember that very fondly. And then he's a very egocentric person. So it wouldn't surprise me that he's watched Sutton and he knows, he's heard what's out there. It doesn't have to be said that the torch is going to be passed. The Broncos don't have to pull Sutton aside. It's obvious. Sutton showed last year he has wide receiver 1 traits. He is the future of this offense. Sanders limped into this year literally and figuratively on the last year of his contract, coming off an Achilles. Meanwhile, Sutton's been dominating practice again. He's forming that chemistry with Joe Flacco. He's looking to, have a breakout season. To me, and then Sanders gets on the field for 11-on-11s for the first time, and then he erupts today, given the opportunity, given the fact that he's feeling himself. That's no coincidence to me. So it's a pure power play. It's a full ego move by Emmanuel Sanders. It doesn't take anything away from him. That's just the type of person or type of professional he is in this locker room. But it's no surprise that it happened today when he's trying to find his groove and he's trying to reclaim that reputation. He said it himself earlier this offseason. He wants to be a Pro Bowl receiver. He wants to be in the NFL top 100. Those little things mean a lot to him. Some players don't care about little accolades like that, but those titles mean a lot to Sanders. He doesn't want to give up that title of wide receiver 1, and he sees Courtland Sutton taking it, and he is not happy about it, Chad.
Yeah, and it's just, it didn't sound like by the time the practice concluded that there had been any, burying of the hatchet. In fact, after practice, when the Broncos were done, Sutton, I was told, ran to the back entrance to the locker room and was chased by Mike Kliss trying to get a comment, wouldn't give it to him, into the door, disappears. Meanwhile, Sanders very calmly collects himself, walks straight through the media, through the front door, politely declines comment, and neither one of them ended up commenting on what happened. But to me, and of course, here's the thing, a lot of fans don't realize this, but their day is not over once practice is done. I mean, they go inside, they're going to eat, they might catch a shower, but they're going to eat, they're going to work out, they might lift, they're going to go into the film room, they're going to have meetings. They're going to be stuck with each other further on throughout the day. So it's probably going to be some, hopefully not so awkward in terms of, let's hope that once they got out from the scrutiny of everybody else and, they were inside the building, maybe they could iron out the kinks. I don't know. But what I've been told is this, and here's what I can't say for sure which of these are true. I heard 2 different things. I was told 2 different things. And I think part of this, Zach, is that people there watching this unfold, they had different perspectives. They were interpreting it in different ways because, you're at a distance, you're watching this, you don't necessarily know everything as it's happening in real time in terms of all the information. But we talked about and mentioned that there was the false starts. Okay, after practice initially started, the offense was looking good. Sanders was out there, things were cranking. Then the false starts, and that one of those false starts was on Garrett Bowles. Now, here's where things get unclear, is that I've been told on one hand that Emmanuel Sanders jumped on GB, on Garrett Bowles for the false start and kind of got after him, and that Sutton somehow took exception to that and fired back at Sanders. And then I also heard the converse. I heard the opposite of that it was Sutton who jumped on GB, and Sanders checked him, saying, this isn't your job. Now, I can understand it in both ways. Like, if it happened with Sanders being the one jumping on and Sutton, taking exception and vice versa, both make sense to me. But at this point, we don't know exactly which way it was triggered. But it does sound like, Zach, somehow that last false start that was triggered by Garrett Bowles was what somehow was the straw that broke this camel's back and set it off.
Well, it's also been the bane of contention, through the first couple weeks of training camp, Chad, something Vic Fangio has talked about, the pre-snap penalties, the mental errors on the offensive side of the ball. And when it's the same culprit, the entire team starts to get frustrated because they're all getting blamed for one guy making the same mistake. I'm not surprised if that's what happened. Someone blew their lid. But if Emmanuel Sanders, a veteran leader on this team, or supposedly calls out a young player, and then another young player calls out the leader for calling out the young player, that is not a good leadership power set up there. That would mean that Sanders is not respected at all, and it signals like an old guard, new guard thing where, the younger players are kind of making their presence felt. Either way, the writing's on the wall as far as I'm concerned, and I think Sanders sees that too. That's where I keep coming back to. He knows it's probably his last year here. He knows Sutton is going to be the man for years to come, and he's doing everything in his power now, physically and emotionally, to get back and to still make his presence felt some way and to hang on to what he accomplished and hopefully make that battle a little tougher on Sutton, who is the future regardless. You can't stop Father Time, Chad, ultimately.
And that's true. However, here's where things really get interesting. Is that might be true, that he sees writing on the wall and he's doing what he can to stop the onset of the inevitable. However, we can't deny, and it was the same last year. When he was on the field, the offense had a completely different look. It was much more productive, efficient, had explosive, properties to it. And that was even with Case Keenum as the trigger man. When he went down, fans, you can remember, you go back and think to the final quarter of that season. Go look at the stats. I mean, everything went down, and that was with Sutton as the number one. And so we see early today, everything I was told by my guys that were there, how great, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the first team offense, who had kind of, as we've talked about on the pod, lost many days in a row, and then they've had a couple of successful days where it seemed they were the victors over the defense and so on and so forth. But it's really been a fair to middling type of performance overall from the offense. Like something's missing, like a piece is missing. And now we know what it was. It was Emmanuel Sanders, who brings a dynamic to this thing that Sutton at this stage in his career simply does not. Now, I say that only to basically lay out the fact that if that's how it plays out this season, it'll be interesting to see if Sanders can make himself that. I mean, if his presence on this offense is that invaluable, and Father Time doesn't appear to have taken too much out of him this year, and he can stay healthy. That's a big if, because that's where also Father Time comes into play. The Broncos, they might not be in a position, beggars can't be choosers. They need every offensive weapon they can get right now. And if a year from now we find out that, Sanders had himself a solid year, and the offense, we know what it looks like when he's not there, the Broncos are going to be in a tough position in terms of what do we do with this now 33-year-old wide receiver who has established himself as such an integral part of our offense. Meanwhile, though, the flip side of that coin is the onus remains not on Sutton or on Sanders, but on Sutton. Sutton's the one that has to show this front office, look, it's going to be okay after 2019 for you to let Sanders go because I have arrived. I'm here. And we just haven't quite yet seen him make that leap. And we're not going to be able to see it till the actual games come around.
And Chad, there is no denying at all that Emmanuel Sanders makes us a better offense. There's no denying it. He's an integral piece, as you said. It's the reason why the Broncos did not draft or sign a pure speedster. He is that. He is the resident game breaker in that receiving core. But to me, ultimately, it doesn't give him the right, what he's accomplished or not, to, if he did this, take out his frustrations and kind of spark a physical fight between a younger teammate. If it's based and rooted in jealousy or resentment or envy or whatever, if he had a valid reason, sure. But to spark it over the fact that he feels threatened because Sutton hasn't proved himself, I mean, that's it takes it a little too far. He knows what's up. He knows that even if he has a good season this year, Emmanuel Sanders, he'll probably sign somewhere else on a prove-it deal. He'll probably get a 2-year, 3-year contract at most. Meanwhile, the Broncos are set for a while with Courtland Sutton, Deshaun Hamilton, Juwan Winfrey, Tim Patrick, all young receivers. All one thing that Emmanuel Sanders does not have on his side, and that's simply age.
I have to wonder how much of this, now this is just me theorizing and spitballing, okay? But I have to wonder, too, how much of this might even be resentment or some leftover resentment to what happened with Demaryius Thomas's departure from this team, and perhaps Sanders somehow, some way blaming Sutton or at least holding that against him, even though, Sutton can control that he was drafted to the Denver Broncos. He's just got to do what he can. He's got to make hay. He's got to find his way in the NFL. Came to the Broncos, and it just so happened that, they already had the exact carbon copy of him that was a 9-year veteran already on the team. That writing was on the wall immediately after the draft. We knew that. We knew that it was only a short matter of time for Demaryius Thomas. I don't think any of us expected it to happen in the middle of the season ahead of Week 9, but it did. And Sanders suddenly lost his one of his best friends who he's played with since 2014. I wonder how much, Zach, that might have contributed to perhaps some of whatever the hard feelings Sanders seems to be harboring towards Courtland Sutton.
I wouldn't put it past him given his, eccentric personality, but if Emmanuel Sanders is holding it against Courtland Sutton because the Broncos drafted Sutton, then the Broncos traded Demaryius Thomas, that is just plain weird, Chad. That goes beyond football. That's a serious issue that Sanders would have to confront with himself. If the resentment goes that deep, you don't want a guy like that in the locker room anyway.
Well, before we take a break, I want to just take this question here because, as everybody knows, it might not be Friday, it might not be Mile High Mailbag Friday, but Zach and I are your football priests, and whenever we can, we're going to be here to offer you the absolution and answers to your burning Broncos questions. And obviously today, it was kind of a watershed moment in terms of questions for us, hitting us from Twitter especially. Fans worried over what this means and the implications and all that. This comes from Rob on Twitter, @IdlehandsF365. He says, early Friday mailbag question, but will this competitive issue between the two bring out the best of both? And will the coaches / front office need to step in? Now, I think the coaches have to step in on some level, Zach. There's no getting around that. They have to somehow do what they can as an authority figure to stop this from bleeding out onto practice again. But from the front office, I saw some fans today tweeting back on the links we were published saying, trade Sanders, get him out of there, trade Sanders. Which to me, I'm saying, pump the brakes because this offense needs Emmanuel Sanders right now.
Yeah, that's a severe overreaction, and that's coming, and I hate to say it, from the same fan base that's declared Drew Locke a bust with the Broncos, but it's not going to happen. He's not going to be traded. Nothing is going to happen with personnel moves. They're going to move past this. In a couple of weeks, we won't even remember this story, Chad. Hopefully, if things settle correctly, it's in the best case scenario, a competitive moment, competitive spark between an older player looking to reclaim his past and a young player and ascending fast in this team. That's all we can hope it is right now. If it goes further than that, we'll see it in a couple weeks, but no personnel moves are going to be made from John Elway in the front office in response to this.
Tricky day, and who knows? We'll probably end up having to circle back and talk more about this later in the week because today, of course, you're listening to this on Tuesday. Zach and I are going to be off the next day at least for Building the Broncos to publish the Scout's Eye preview, and there's probably going to be guys at the podium between now and then. There's a game Thursday night, and of course, we'll be here for the gut reaction immediately following the game for your listening pleasure late Thursday night, early Friday. So we'll see what shakes out on this storyline between now and then, and I imagine we'll probably have to address this at least from some other angle later on. But let's put this to bed for now. We're going to turn the page, talk about a few other things that happened on Monday, but first we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, a couple things I want to touch on. First and foremost, the hits keep coming to the off-ball linebacker core. Josey Jewell left practice early, and at first it wasn't clear that he was hurt because he wasn't carted off or anything. He just was seen leaving the field with trainers. After practice, Vic Fangio said, quote, he kind of tweaked his side a little bit. I told Vince Garcia, he was one of the athletic trainers, the head in fact, to take him in and start treating him, closed quote. So once again, we don't know. It doesn't sound serious, Zach, but with now Todd Davis down, now Josey Jewell, the two starting duo down, plus Joseph Jones, who technically, not counting Dakota Watson, who hasn't played off-ball linebacker in a while, Joseph Jones was the next most experienced linebacker the Broncos had. He's down. His timetable to return right now is up in the air. It could be a couple weeks. With a torn pec or a tricep injury, it could end up costing him the entire season. We don't know yet. Meanwhile, that puts the onus on the Alexander Johnsons of the world, Keyshawn Bierria, Josh Watson, and Joe Dineen. So if, in fact, this injury ends up costing Jewell more than a day of practice, do you see the Broncos maybe having to make a move in terms of bringing in an outside guy?
I was going to say this screams like a nudge from the football gods, reminding the Broncos they probably should have signed an inside linebacker or drafted a pure inside linebacker higher up. I would think they would be okay with the depth they have right now. I like Josh Watson, and Alexander Johnson was one of the standouts from the game. But the depth now is a little worrisome. At least you have to have some camp bodies. And when Jewell comes back, when Davis comes back, they're going to work in slowly. So, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they brought someone in, but they're not going to make any big splash trades. This guy would just be insurance and depth right now to hold out a couple spots and keep the seat warm for Jewell and Davis when they return. I will say, I hope, obviously, Jewell isn't injured, but the good case to me is it gives them an opportunity to look further at Josh Watson, at Alexander Johnson, a guy they're very high on. So maybe they can unearth a gem and they can find in this bad news some good news that they have a long-term viability option behind Davis and Jewell.
And that's actually kind of the perspective that Vic Fangio took on Monday. He said, quote, "You hate to see anybody go down, even if it's not too bad, but with Todd being down and Josie now, we'll see what's up with them. It does give those guys great opportunities. They are not one position right now that's worried about reps," close quote. So, yeah, right now amongst those 4 remaining guys, plenty of reps to go around. Plus, you got to factor in Justin Holland still seeing a few snaps. And potentially in an emergency situation, you put Dakota Watson in there. And in fact, I know when camp opened, the Broncos were even rotating Jeff Holland in at off-ball linebacker just to kind of see how it looked. I don't love that, but they did try it out. So we'll see how that shakes out. But, yeah, one of these guys, I hope, we have to hope, I think, takes this thing and runs with it. And if that ends up being Alexander Johnson, great. I mean, it was kind of cool watching that game, really seeing him, at least in my opinion, for the first time with an extended look on defense with the Denver Broncos. And that 6'2" length, man, at off ball, it just makes the defense look different. Now, obviously, with that size, you lose a little bit of the lateral twitchiness in terms of just that quickness that comes with a smaller guy, slightly smaller linebacker, like even a Joseph Jones. However, I liked what I saw from Johnson for the most part.
Yeah, I could definitely see why now the Broncos committed so heavily to him last year. It kind of caught a lot of us by surprise, but they think they have a long-term project, and he's gotten better since from what we saw last year on the field. He's definitely, I think, going to thrive more in Vic Fangio's system, as most players do. But yeah, he's the guy to me, Chad, not Josh Watson, not anyone else. He's the one that's going to benefit the most or potentially hurt his case the most from this absence from Jewell now. So hopefully against the Seahawks, he steps up and establishes himself truly as that direct backup to the 2 starters.
All right, last thing I want to touch on today, and then we'll get out of here, is just kind of an update on the quarterback situation. So 2 things. One, we learned from Fangio on Monday that, yes, in fact, we will see the debut of Joe Flacco with the Denver Broncos on Thursday night against the Seattle Seahawks. It's unclear, and the Broncos have not yet decided exactly how long Flacco is going to play. My guess would be 2 or 3 possessions, which might end up encompassing like the first quarter, but they're not going to risk him too unnecessarily in what will be his first preseason game, with still, after that game, 3 more to go. So we're going to see Flacco. I want to ask you what you expect to see there. Well, let's start there. What do you expect to see from Flacco in this opener? What version of Flacco, especially considering that on Monday he was picked off a couple times by Kareem Jackson, both of which were returned for scores?
Yeah, I think, it's so hard to read into preseason because I think the Broncos coaches will be purposely vanilla as to not give anything away. On the other token, my heart would say that Flacco would want to push the ball down the field in his first opportunity to kind of, already get back to that reputation as that big arm guy who still has a place in this league. I would not be surprised if he got 2 or 3 series, and in those 2 or 3 series, they took a few deep shots down the field just to see what they can do. Even if he gets picked off, it's still preseason. They can still justify it as preseason. It doesn't matter just yet. It's not the regular season. But my brain tells me you'll probably see maybe 7-6 points, maybe 3 points. It's not going to be some explosion in his 3 series. He still has a lot of work to do, a lot of chemistry to build, but no injuries, Chad, and maybe some productive drives. I think that would be a success on Thursday.
The other thing that we learned on Monday, first off, as it regards Drew Locke, both of us talked about in the podcast following the opener that as let's just say unprepared as Drew Locke appeared to be for NFL speed. He looked like a deer in the headlights at times, even though, he completed, I think, 7 of 11 passes. And, on paper, he looked efficient, even though his yards per completion were very, very low. However, we came out of that saying, look, you want to get the most out of Drew Locke. You want to develop him. That's what the preseason's for. Give him the reps. Give him additional reps. Give him the second-team reps. At least on some level, it sounds like the Broncos are thinking similarly, because on Monday he seemed to receive an increase in second-team reps. Now, Kevin Hogan continued to also get some, so they're splitting them in the technical sense. However, when the chips were down late in the move the ball period, kind of think of it as a 2-minute drill, it was Drew Locke out there to close practice, not Kevin Hogan. So afterward, Vic Fangio basically said, He did see some more reps on second team. How much he's going to play and what the rotation is going to be on Thursday night, Zach, we don't yet know.
Yeah, I could see it both ways, Chad. Honestly, if he wants to motivate Drew Locke, if he wants to take a tough love approach, he can start Hogan over him.
Yeah, we'll see how it shakes out. I mean, it's still early in the process, and hopefully, I think all we can ask for is we get to see another extended look at Drew Locke, as he did receive quite a few snaps in the preseason opener, and he needs to continue to get a lion's share of those backup reps. However, the Broncos end up divvying them out. So that'll do it, though, for today's episode of the Huddle Up Podcast. Zach and I, as mentioned, will be back in the saddle on following immediately the Thursday night game. In the meantime, you're going to get some Building the Broncos scouting. The game Scouts Eye Preview is going to come out for you on Wednesday, so stay tuned for that. Make sure you're following the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. You can find my partner Zack Kelberman on Twitter at KelbermanNFL. Remember, that's his new handle, at KelbermanNFL. Myself, at Chad and Jensen. Also, make sure you're checking out the content that Zach's cranking out over there at Heavy.com. Plenty of Broncos coverage still. He's still covering your team. And also sprinkled in some general NFL content and coverage. So check that out. Follow his writings on Heavy.com. Easiest way to do that, I remind you, follow him on Twitter. All of our listeners on YouTube, keep doing your thing. If you like what you're hearing here, also go on Apple Podcasts, give us a creative review. For Zack Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. We will talk to you after preseason game 2.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.